My name's Arthur Reeves and I'm the ringing master for the St Martin's Guild. And in this presentation, I want to talk about how our memory works. In other words, how we can improve the techniques for how we learn things, particularly related to ringing. This presentation will form two parts. The first will look at how our memory works, how our brain works, and to unpick some of the mysteries behind that. And then secondly, I want to look at some techniques that will help us to improve our learning, hopefully, particularly again in relation to bell ringing and bell ringing technique, bell ringing methods. So why? Why do I want to spend some time looking at this, and why do I think it's worthwhile? Well, first of all, I think memory is just fascinating. I'm fascinated by this. How is it that I can walk into a room thinking I need to get something and forget within seconds what it is I need to get, and yet I can remember things from decades ago, and I can remember things that might, on face value, seem quite pointless to remember, or things I'd definitely rather forget. So memory, I think, is fascinating for those reasons. But I think it is important for us to reflect on the nature of memory and how memory works, and particularly its limitations, because I think if we focus on this, we can learn more effectively techniques to help us learn more efficiently, and perhaps not become so frustrated when things don't click so quickly. And we can avoid putting ourselves into situations where perhaps we don't learn so effectively. So we can improve our learning techniques and make that more efficient. So that's why I think memory is important. That's why I think it's worth spending sort of half hour or so thinking about this and reflecting on this. So let's get started. We're going to begin with a quick activity. Okay, so in a moment, I'm going to show you a slide with 17 symbols on it. Without a pen or paper and without pausing the video, I'd like you to try and remember as many of those 17 symbols in the order that you see them as you possibly can. Okay, so 10 seconds, no pen or paper. Good luck. Okay, and that's your 10 seconds up. So now, and you can pause the video at this moment, try and remember in the order that you saw them as many of those digits as you can. Either say it to someone else, or say it out loud, or write them down. So how many could you remember? Well, here are the numbers again. Okay, here are the symbols that I showed you, and probably most people could probably remember the first sort of 7, possibly 8. So 5, 9, 3, 0, 2, 8, 7, possibly one or two more after that. But it's highly unlikely if you've done the activity as I asked you to, that you're going to remember much more than that. Most people won't be able to. So don't kick yourself if you're saying, my goodness, I've got a really poor memory. I couldn't remember many of those in that order. You're not expected to, and I'll explain why in just a moment. Let's do that again. Okay, so this time, same set of rules. So again, 10 seconds, different symbols this time, and you need to try and remember the order those 17 symbols come to you in. Okay, off we go. And there we are. Now, I'm sure that the second time you did that was much easier. You probably didn't need any more than a nanosecond, less than a second, to remember that, and you can recall that really easily. You don't even need to think about it. You had 9.9 seconds rest there, because actually as soon as you saw those symbols, you recognized them. Now you might say, well, you're just cheating. But just to reflect a moment, I gave you the same rules, and you had 17 symbols to remember in 10 seconds. And yet one of those tasks was extremely difficult and the other extremely easy. Let's think about this in a moment, and think about what's going on in those two activities and what the differences are. I want to talk to you a little bit about what the brain is. Some people, or many people, think the brain is simply one big sort of memory box or repository box. And I think people often say they can't remember things because they have a bad memory. Well, I think that for the vast, vast majority of us, that isn't true. And actually, the more you begin to understand how the brain works and how memory works, the more remarkable you will find it. In fact, it's wrong to say the brain has one memory or the brain is one memory. It's much more complex than that. And really, sort of neurologists think that our minds are formed of three different memories. Let's have a look at these in detail. So the first is that sensory memory. Okay, it collects data. That's what its function is, to simply collect data from our five senses. So it sees things, it hears things, so on and so forth, and it collects that data. It can't hold very much information. That's not its purpose. It simply is collecting data all of the time. Then you have our working memory. And our working memory goes to our long-term memory, interacts with our long-term memory to collect and make sense of what's coming in from our senses. So something's coming into your senses, and your working memory, its job is to process that and interact with the long-term memory to go and find out what it is that's coming into your mind. In some ways, I think it's unhelpful to think of the working memory as a memory in the traditional sense, as a repository box. I think in other ways, it's easier to think of it like a super fast processing machine. And I mean, it really, really is super fast. We'll come to that in just a minute. It's simply an interactive tool from your sensory memory to your long-term memory. So, for example, you're cooking a meal and you're looking at all the ingredients and you're sensing what those ingredients are. You're sensing whether they're in date or out of date, whether they're safe to use for your cooking. And your working memory is simply collecting information from the long-term memory so that you can make sense of what's coming in, and so you can decide what ingredients are safe to use and which are not safe to use. The working memory, therefore, is, in terms of holding information, actually it's quite weak at holding information. Again, neurologists reckon that it can hold between 4 and 7 bits of information for less than 20 seconds. So it's not particularly good at holding information. But that's not what it's designed to do. It's designed to be a processing tool. And we ought to be thankful for this. Although it's a bit frustrating at times that the working memory perhaps can't hold more information for longer, we ought to be thankful that it can't. Because if it held more information, or if we didn't have a working memory, we'd simply become overloaded with information. So our working memory is like a filter. It's a process. It gets rid of stuff it doesn't think we need, and it keeps stuff that we think it does need. It goes back to perhaps prehistoric man with that fight or flight. If we're seeing a danger in front of us, we need to know what to do. We need to know what to do very quickly. Our working memory shouldn't hold millions of bits of information because it would never make sense of it. So that's the purpose of the working memory, to make us act. And then we have our long-term memory. The long-term memory is that repository of information. Now, people disagree about the long-term memory. Some people think that it is like a camcorder and it holds information of our lifetime forever. Other people disagree, and other people think that it can forget things, but it still holds an awful amount of information. Other people think it never forgets things, and actually what's happened is our working memory can't find it, can't find that information. So there's some disagreement. But I think whatever the truth is around the long-term memory, it can hold an awful amount of information. And again, studies have shown that it can hold information for a lifetime. And the long-term memory is that repository box. Okay, it stores all the information that we're going to need, but it just stores it. And it's the working memory that needs to collect that information to bring to the forefront of our mind to make sense of it. So just to give some of the science behind it, within our brains exist some 100 billion nerve cells or neurons. And just think about that for a moment, 100 billion. And between those nerve cells are these synaptic connections, 1 quadrillion synaptic connections. which equates to 1 million billion connections between all of the different neurons. So again, just to recap, the working memory's job is to link up, to zoom around the synaptic connections to collect information from the long-term memory and zoom it to your working memory within nanoseconds to make sense of what's coming in from your sensory memory. And just for a moment, reflect on what your mind is doing at this very minute. First of all, you're listening to me, hopefully. You listen to each individual word and to the sentences that I'm forming. So your working memory, well, first of all, your sensory memory is collecting all of that data. Your working memory is taking that in, it's zooming around your long-term memory, collecting those individual words so that you can make sense of them. But more than that, you're putting those individual words into context of the sentences that I'm forming so that you can make proper sense of them in the way that I'm talking to you about them. It's transferring them to your working memory so you can make sense of it. It's zooming it back to your long-term memory and lodging it somewhere, hopefully, so that you can remember at least some of this. And this is all happening within nanoseconds because as you're listening to what I've just said and making sense of what I've just said, I'm talking about more things as things are going. But at the same time as that, if you just look around, instantaneously, your working memory can see, or your sensory memory, is taking in lots of data about what's around you, what you can see. And your working memory is seeing them, processing them, dipping into your long-term memory so you can recognize these items, name them, know how to use them, know what's safe, know what isn't safe, and so on. You might also be thinking about what you're going to do next, what you're going to have for dinner, or what you're going to eat or do, or whatever chores you have to do. When you get up to go for a walk, your mind is instantly recognizing the space that you have to go into. It's navigating your muscles and your senses to balance you and navigate you through those spaces. And all of this is happening at the same time as your brain is instructing your body to do the things that it needs to do to live. So allowing your body to breathe and to pump blood around, so on and so forth. So, all of these things are happening at the same time as you hearing the words that I'm saying and, from your other senses, that data coming in that you're instantaneously, without even thinking about it, making sense of. And I sometimes think that comparing the brain and the memory to, as I've said, a big repository box is unhelpful. But I think in some ways it does act a bit like an Amazon warehouse. So your working memory is like the robotic computer that zooms around collecting things from Amazon, and the storage workhouse is like your long-term memory, that vast warehouse storing millions and millions of bits of information like the items that Amazon sells us. And when it needs to go and collect it, your working memory zooms around really quickly, finding the information. And maybe the more times that the working memory goes to that same place, the same memory, maybe those synaptic connections are strengthened, and therefore it's quicker and easier to get those memories than it is for a new piece of information that you've perhaps not had to recollect that quickly. Let's go back to those two tasks that I said at the beginning of this presentation then. So the first was a set of, as I said, a set of numbers. And what's happening here? Well, first of all, your working memory will instantly recognize that they're symbols. Okay? That those symbols are numbers. It's going to recognize that. Okay? It's going to recognize that very quickly. And it goes to your long-term memory. It knows their numbers. It recognizes those. But asks you to remember them in a certain order. And your working memory has nothing to pin those digits, those numbers onto. So it's struggling. It's going to your long-term memory to try and make sense of those formations of 17 numbers, and it can't. So it's working overload in those 10 seconds to try and remember this, and it can't, because the working memory can't remember things for very long, and it can't remember very much for very long. So it can't remember more than, as we say, between 4 and 7 bits of information. So if you can remember, if you remember 7 digits in order, that's probably about average. But the same task I set you with a different set of 17 symbols, in this case they're letters, again, your working memory not only instantly recognises, because it's zoomed to the long-term memory, it recognises that there are letters, but it recognises the context which it finds those letters in. It's an easy sentence. It's probably one of the earliest memories you have from reading. It's lodged in your long-term memory. It zooms to your working memory really quickly. That data can pin to something that you already know. And your working memory has to do no work here whatsoever. It can remember it instantly, and you can recall it without trouble at all. So, you within those 10 seconds that you had to learn this, you didn't need to learn it. You've already learnt it. It's in your memory. It's lodged there. It has been for many, many years, and you can recall it straight away. So that's what's happening here. So I think we've begun to unmask a little bit about how our brains and how our memory operate. Let's have a look at 3 different conclusions then we can make about our brains and our memories. The first then is something I've looked at already, that your memory is not just a repository box. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, a theorist named Ebbinghaus conducted a study. Now, this study was conducted only on himself to begin with, but this study has been replicated numerous times in the last 100 years, and similar results have come up each time. And what Ebbinghaus did was learn a whole load of what he called nonsense words. And then he tested himself on how many he could remember, simply recall, over time. And he recorded this down onto a very famous chart that became known as the forgetting curve. And what Ebbinghaus found was that his ability to recall and retain that information drastically reduced as time went on. So within 20 minutes of having learnt these words, this new data, okay, he'd forgotten 20% of what he had learned. And I think that's frightening, actually. As a school teacher, I reflect on my lessons, and assuming that my students have focused, as of course they always do, focus in my lesson completely. Even if they've done that, by the time they get to their next lesson, have sat through 20 minutes of their next lesson or 20 minutes of lunch, they would have forgotten 20% of what they've learnt in my class. And it just gets worse. So within a day, 50% of what we have tried to learn has been forgotten. Within 2 days, over 60%, and so on, until we get down to this sort of plateau around sort of 6 days, really, where over 90% of what we tried to learn has been forgotten. So what Ebbinghaus tells us, and what subsequent studies have shown, is that if we want to learn something, just learning it on day 1 and then leaving it and not coming back to it, our brains are going to forget it because it's not going to be lodged into our long-term memory, or it will be in our long-term memory somewhere, but our working memory simply can't find it, can't access it. Those synaptic connections are too weak for it to find, or it's simply been forgotten, depending on which view of the long-term memory is correct. We don't know that yet. The second thing is that we know our brain will often take shortcuts. Okay, this is how optical illusions work, and in some ways you can understand that. I described to you exactly what our brain is doing every single nanosecond of the day. So our brain sort of makes assumptions, it makes shortcuts. Here's a couple of examples. Very famous optical illusion here. What colour are these squares? Well, I think it's quite obvious that A and B are different colour squares. The A is on a dark grey, the B is on a sort of white or light grey square. Actually, that's an optical illusion. Our brain is making assumptions there. Again, you can look at the solution here. What's happening is that the shadow formed from the grey cylinder over the B makes us think that B is on that lighter square. It's not. When you compare the colours from A to B, they're the same colour, that darker grey. So it masks that because we automatically lighten things in shadows. It's an optical illusion, but it's because our brain's making a shortcut based on what it thinks it's seeing. Here's another one here.
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
So again, a very obvious example when you see it the second time round, but our brain is so focused on looking at the white team passing the ball around that we don't notice something very, very obvious when we look at it again. So our brain takes shortcuts. Okay? And this impacts the way that we learn things, because our brain will often assume things and will often take very quick shortcuts when it does so. So we have to be really careful when we're learning things. The third thing is that we know we learn best in certain circumstances versus other certain circumstances. And I think I think this is an important point to make, because I think I'd like to suggest that the tower ringing chamber is a situation that we do not learn well in for a very obvious reason. Look at this poem on the left-hand side. So if you want to feel secure, do what you already know how to do. If you want to grow, go to the cutting edge of your competence. It means a temporary loss of security, but know that when you don't quite know what you're doing, that you are growing. And I think that's a really nice poem. Really, we can stick with what we know, and that's absolutely fine. So when we continually ring the same method over and over again, that's fine. We're within our comfort zone. And most of the time we exist in our comfort zone, and that's a good place to be. But within that comfort zone, we're not going to be learning anything. Just outside that comfort zone exists the learning zone. And that's where we feel slightly outside of our comfort zone. Perhaps we're learning a slight variation of that method or a new method, and we might need some help from other people. But just outside of that comfort zone is our learning zone. And that's where we're learning. So, for example, when you learn a new method for the first time, say playing Bob Doubles, for a long time you'll be sort of in that learning zone, and then you will hit that comfort zone. Okay, and that will become something quite easy to do. You're probably in the learning zone for longer than you think, actually, because the more times you ring the same method over and over again, you'll begin to see new things. So playing Bob Doubles, you might begin to see how the bells interact with each other, or where you pass the treble. Once you hit the comfort zone, though, there's nothing wrong with that. We exist there most of the time of our lives. You're going to continue learning. But something that Tom Seneger talks about, and something that isn't in this poem, is this idea of the panic zone. That if we overextend ourselves, we're going to enter what's called the panic zone. We're too far outside of our comfort zone. We're trying to learn things that are just beyond our reach at the moment. That doesn't mean they'll never be within our reach, but it's just too far at the moment, and we're in our panic zone. We start to feel quite stressed. We're not going to be able to learn. So, for example, if you're confident at playing Bob Doubles, going on to learn Bristol Surprise Major next is probably unlikely to result in much success. You're going to be entering that panic zone because it's too much of a bigger leap. You're going to be panicked. You're not going to be able to learn that. Likewise, if you're in perhaps a very public place, you are likely to be entering the panic zone. I think that the ringing chamber is a very public place. So again, learning new things in the ringing chamber is unlikely to result in an effective way of learning. You've got preparation beforehand. Dodson and Yerk talk about the stress behind learning and how, for a certain amount of stress is good for learning. It's actually really conducive to good learning, but actually too much stress is disastrous. And I think this chart explains that really well. Think about that within our jobs at the moment. If like me, you've been in a job that has no stress at all, that can be a really bad thing for our learning because we have no need to learn new things. So too little stress means actually we're unlikely to learn because we have no need to. So we're becoming active, we become laid back. A little bit of stress can be a really good thing, or is a really good thing. So a little bit of, it keeps us on our toes. It keeps that pressure up a little bit. So actually being in the tower and ringing that method that you've been learning from home actually is going to be a really good thing because it's going to force you to do so. If you don't encourage yourself, have other people encourage you to learn new things, then you're going to stay in this sort of inactive zone. But if you go too far out, if you're in a situation where you're taking on too much stress, your mind is going to become overloaded. You're going to get exhausted. Your brain will shut out that new learning, and it simply isn't going to be conducive to effective learning. And again, if that continues, I hope people haven't been in this situation with their jobs. The likelihood is at some point in our lives we're likely to get into this stage. You're going to reach sort of burnout, anxiety, panic, and perhaps even anger. And I think there are two conclusions to reach from this. The first is that we've got to understand the ringing chamber is a very public place, and therefore, yes, it's going to provide some stress. We need to make sure that it's optimum stress, but not too much stress. So again, reflect on that is useful. Learning new things in the tower is not going to be conducive to good learning, partly because, as Ebbinghaus tells us, we're going to forget things very quickly, new things that we learn, and that's not our fault, that's just the way our memory works. And secondly, because it is highly likely that we're going to be entering sort of these zones if we're trying to learn new things. The second thing is, if you've got a lot of things going on in your life outside of ringing, if you're already sort of in this sort of period with other things going on for whatever reason, hopefully temporary thing with work or whatever, learning new things with ringing is unlikely to be conducive to effective learning either. Don't beat yourself up about that. Just acknowledge that for that period of time, you're unlikely to be able to learn new things effectively until those other conditions reduce. As I say, just don't beat yourself up about that. I think it's the best advice there. So I hope I've outlined three things really that we do know about memory and about how our memory works. The first is not a repository box. We can't assume that we can learn something and just remember it. And if we can't, which are the vast majority of us, we won't, don't beat ourselves up about that. Don't think we have a poor memory. The second is our brain will take shortcuts. Okay, that's inevitable. We have to just reflect on that. And that actually there are certain circumstances that we learn better in than others. So in the next part of the presentation, I want to look at where we go from here. So now we know all of this stuff. What do we do with it? How can we learn some techniques that will help us become more effective learners? And I want to look at three things. The first is some generic advice. The second is some advice that I found useful when I've been learning methods for ringing. And the third is some advice from some other ringers that I think is useful when I ask them. So the first, some generic advice. Well, Ebbinghaus gives quite a daunting picture, really, of memory and how memory works. But he also says that actually what matters is how we review things. So if we review things on a regular basis, short and sharp, then actually we are going to retain far more information. So again, remember, within a day, we are likely to have lost 20% of what we, in fact, more, depending on which study you look at, of what we previously had learned. But if we review it, then suddenly our ability to retain that information increases. And again, if we do so, over time, so if we learn a new method and we're going to ring it in 5 or 6 days' time, if we learn from day one and just don't look at it again, we're not going to actually retain it. If we look at it on day 1 and don't look at it again until day 5, we're not going to retain it. But if we learn on day 1 and come back to it on a regular basis, then we are far, far more likely to retain more of that method than if we just then leaving it. Okay, and you might say, well, I don't have time to do this. How am I going to do this? Actually, it's short and sharp. So 5 minutes is enough just to look over your method. Okay, that's the first thing. The second, if I just move this out of the way, the second thing is that there are different ways of learning. There's something called passive learning and there's something called active learning. Passive learning is when you just look at something. So you just look at perhaps a blue line. That's unlikely to retain much information. Okay, I quite often play a game myself. I love reading a newspaper, and quite often get to the middle of the newspaper, having just been reading it, and I think, what's on the front page? But actually, passive learning isn't very effective for retaining information. You have to make your mind active. So the advice that we give pupils in my school is this: you study a new concept, you stop studying it. So you look at one method. You're going to look at 5. You're going to look at 1, and then you do some active things at those regular basis to retrieve from your memory. So perhaps you draw it out. Perhaps you create a mind map around it. Maybe that wouldn't work so well with ringing. But you tell somebody what you can remember. You ask somebody to question you. And once you do this a couple of times, then you go back to studying. But you have to do these active steps in order to keep retaining that information. And a really quick technique, which I think does work really well with ringing, is copy, cover, write, check. Something you probably did at school. So you have the method. Okay, you have it in front of you, you write it out, you cover it, you write it out again, and then you check the mistakes, you correct the mistakes, and then you do it again, you cover it, you write it back out, and so on and so forth. And if you do that, and it takes 5 minutes, you do that for 3 or 4 times in between learning it for the first time and ringing it, you are far, far more likely to remember all of the aspects of the method. Something that I did when I first began learning to call bob doubles, for example, I struggled to remember the order of the bobs. So if you're going to call a 120 bob doubles, you put 3 bobs in and you have to put them in a particular order. And I struggled to remember the order they go in. Make the bob, run in, run out. But our brain likes connections. It likes stories. You can see this quote from Dan Johnson. You can read that for yourself. Our brains seem to like a story. This is why mnemonics work really well. And so when I was learning to ring, to call bob doubles, to conduct bob doubles, I again, make the bob, run in, run out, actually linked really well with bio. So I imagined, washing powder. Okay, it's a silly thing, but it's an easy thing to remember, bio. And that gives me my 120 bob doubles. Bob, in, out. And actually, it doesn't matter then. I've got 3 touches there because I can go in, out, bob in. It doesn't matter. I've learned the order because I've linked it to that image. Again, another example, slightly more complex example, but I was really struggling when I was learning Bristol Surprise Maximus to learn the front work. For some reason, I don't know why, for some reason, I struggled with the front work of 7th place bell. Okay, so, this bit was fine. So do a point 10, do some places in 5, 6, and then I'd go on to the front and I'd struggle to remember what I had to do. I used to confuse it with the beginnings of 3rd place bell. Do I dodge, lead, dodge, or do I do a Stedman lead? You'll see that 3rd place bell and 7th place bell are mirror images. If I get this out of the way, you'll see that 7th place bell is backwards to 3rd place bell and vice versa. Actually, there's a really easy thing to remember here. Again, I don't know why I struggled with that, but I did. So it's a misconception. But once I'd done that once or twice, I realised it was a mistake. Actually, I learned something very, very quick. Stedman, this is what this piece of work is called, 7th place bell, Stedman. And the 2 S's made it very, very easy for me, point 10, 5 place, Stedman work on 7th place bell. Therefore, I knew that the second time I went onto the front in 7th place bell, it wasn't Stedman, it was dodge, lead, dodge. It also told me what I had to do at the beginning of the 3rd place bell. It's not Stedman because the 2 S's don't match up. So again, a very easy technique, and that helped me with that massively. We talked a lot about stories and narratives, and absolutely our minds like stories. So often people will Sorry, so our minds like stories, okay? But actually, our minds also like differences. I sometimes call these sort of memory jolts, things that jolt our memory, things that stand out, things that are a bit different. Actually, there's a really interesting story I read recently about the Amazon warehouse. You'll see it on this photo here. You would think it would make sense for Amazon to put all of the items that are similar to each other next to each other. So if, for example, I don't know, you want to go and get some Campbell's soup, you'd think you'd have a whole ream of shelves full of Campbell's soup and the different varieties. Actually, they don't do that in Amazon. They put the very different items next to each other. So Campbell's soup next to Pringles. Why do they do that? Well, because if you're a robot zooming around or a tired worker going to collect the different items that people have ordered, when you go up to the shelves, collecting something that looks very different from something else is going to jolt your memory. It's harder to confuse a packet of Pringles for a tin of Campbell's soup. It's very easy to confuse one variety of Campbell's soup for another variety of Campbell's soup. So differences help as well. Differences, things that stand out. And people, I know when they're learning things like multi-minor methods, and they're learning the compositions for those multi-minor compositions, often color code things. So Cambridge-based methods will be in one color, in this case in red. Born being a Cambridge-based method, Cambridge Surprise Minor, but Norwich is in purple because Norwich is going to stand out from the Cambridge-based methods, and London in black, and so on and so forth. So I was very lucky to have the opportunity to ask a couple of other ringers who are particularly good at learning things. And this was their advice that I think is worth passing on. So what do other ringers say? Well, first of all, know things well in advance. I think I've hopefully covered that as well. If I'm trying to learn a tricky composition, I'll start a couple of weeks beforehand. Even if I could get away with just needing a couple of days. Again, when I'm walking to work, that time I have to do that, just 10 or 15 minutes of mental revision. Color code, be steady. Don't be hard on yourself. Be steady. One thing at a time. And I think this is true. Learning becomes much easier as you learn more methods. And that's definitely true. The more that you know, the easier it is because you have more connections to make in your mind. Again, it links back to that early activity that we did with the letters versus the numbers. Why are the letters so easy? Because we can connect into our minds already. Sometimes you'll see in towers, more experienced ringers will say something like, let's ring St. Simon's. An experienced ringer will say, I don't know what St. Simon's is. And I'll just quickly look it up in the tower and then ring it without any mistake. And that looks very, very impressive. Actually, it's not that impressive if you know Bob doubles and other doubles methods really well. If you know that, then a variation like St. Simon's is very, very easy to learn. So it's a bit of a trick that looks impressive, but actually is less impressive than it is. So the point here is that learning your 3rd, 4th, 15th, 16th, 30th method is a lot easier than learning your 1st and 2nd method because you have more things to pin onto. You're not learning what the different bits of work are called, for example. You know them all. So I think that is true. A different ringer, so I'll move this down here, was talking about, again, something that I've talked a little bit about, quirky things distinguish the method. Stealing ideas from other people, absolutely. So, a place for the place or a dodge for the dodge, again, learning those things. Again, something that this ringer found useful in Cornwall, learning the bed springs. So here, to go onto the front, you have to go through the bed springs to get to the front. Or in Lessness, the 4 S's in it, 4 dodges. Simple things like that just stand out, those memory jobs. Quite a lot of writing out and thinking through things, so thinking how the grid fits together, where things happen, what happens at the lead end, when the trebles lead in, what the other bells are doing, what's happening at the half leads, thinking about that bigger picture, thinking about the grid and how it slots together, thinking about how things are the same as other methods. Another ringer said, write out the method from the place notation. If you're not sure what that is or how that works, I'm not going to go through it now, but there are other talks on the St. Martin's Guild website that go through this. But again, it gives you that bigger picture. The notation is there. You write out the method because it gives you that whole bigger picture. Again, a useful technique. this is somebody who learns in a very different way to me, but I think it is a useful technique just to share. When you look at people who learn things like 90,000 digits of pi, they'll often talk about memorizing those digits as places, as like a story in their mind. We talk about how our mind likes narrative and stories, and this ringer learns methods like that. So London Surprise Major is a good example. They visualise the skyline of London. I can see why London, and they walk around London in their mind as they're ringing the method to associate the shapes of the skyline. So, this section, you've got the end of Fistblaze Bell. This person imagines Tower Bridge in their minds. They walk down to the needle on the embankment. They head up to the Shell building, and so on and so forth. So again, if you're somebody who likes stories, I've heard this quite commonly, that people give the method, that like walking through it as they're going. And then finally, and I think this is a really useful thing to end on. What you shouldn't do is think, oh, I need to go and practice all of these different techniques. It's a case of finding the technique that works for you. And some of these will work better than others. But I think what is a useful thing to conclude with is it's very easy to look at experienced ringers and think, oh, they can just do it. Those experienced ringers can just ring these things or just do it. But actually, I think all of us, at whatever level of ringing we're at, there's always somebody more experienced than us. And it's very easy to think, oh, they don't have to work at it. But that's not true. And this is from a very experienced ringer and her husband. She's describing how it takes years and years and years of concerted practice to train your brain to do these things, just like with some sports, Johnny Wilkinson or David Beckham. But unless you live with a top quality method ringer, you're never going to see the evidence, the effort that goes in. You're just going to see the results. And I know, the person who gave this piece of advice, her husband is somebody who's very, very experienced at calling very spliced minor, and it seems very easy to them. And I ring with them and think, oh, they can just do that. They can just do it. And she said, but what you don't see is that every single week, my husband goes over the composition and practices the composition every single week, whether he's ringing a appeal of it that week or not, just to keep it fresh in his mind. And I think it's useful to think that, all of us, I would say all of us, find learning difficult at whatever level we're at. But if you're going to learn new things, you've got to push yourself out of that comfort zone and acknowledge that learning is tricky. But hopefully it is also very worthwhile. So I hope you found this presentation useful and interesting. Have a look at the other things on the St Martin's Guild website for other advice, and good luck with your learning. Thank you.